They say silence is never truly empty. It lingers, it breathes, it remembers. In the swamps of Mississippi, silence was heavier than stone, pressing down on the land like an unbroken curse. The year was 1813, and though the sun still rose and set upon the cotton fields, there was a darkness stitched into the very soil, a darkness whispered about in kitchens and on porches, in the shiver of children who dared not ask too many questions. The land itself seemed to know. The trees leaned in close, draped in Spanish moss like mourning veils, their branches groaning when the night wind passed. They creaked not with age, but with memory. The house that stood there was built tall, proud, painted white once, though by then the paint had chipped away, revealing the gray bones of timber beneath. Travelers passing by said the house carried a strange stillness, as though it had swallowed too many screams. The windows reflected no light, even when the sun struck them, and at night, neighbors swore they could see faint glows, not of lanterns but of something more unsettling, flickers of red, like embers refusing to die. Children, too young to know fear's proper weight, told stories of figures wandering the fields. Men without faces, women weeping with their hands bound, chains rattling softly in the grass where no living man walked. These stories were dismissed as childish tales, yet the old ones, the enslaved who had lived long enough to watch generation after generation carried to the fields, they said little. When asked, they only turned their eyes away, lips pressed tight, as though to speak of it might call the shadows back. But the story was real. The silence was not imagined. There had been a night, long ago, when screams had risen from that house like smoke, carried on the wind until even the swamp itself seemed to choke on them. A night when the walls drank blood, and the soil was forced to swallow what human hands had spilled. A night when two enslaved brothers, Isaiah, whose silence was heavier than iron, and Silas, whose fire had burned too brightly for too long, rose from the shadows and did the unthinkable. No preacher's sermon could wash it away. No fire could purify what was done. What began in silence ended in blood, and what ended in blood still lingers in whispers. They do not call a story. They call a curse. And the curse begins here, in the hush before the storm, in the silence that remembers. The master of that house was not remembered for kindness. His name has been swallowed by time, but his cruelty was carved deep into the backs of men and women who carried his fields on their shoulders. He was a man of fists and hollow prayers, a man whose voice struck harder than the lash, whose temper came like sudden storms, blinding, merciless, without reason. Under him, Isaiah and Silas grew like trees starved of light, bent low by the weight of chains, scarred by years that offered nothing but labor and hunger. Isaiah, the elder, bore the cruelty in silence. He was broad, his frame hardened by endless toil, yet his eyes carried the stillness of a river before a flood. He did not beg. He did not cry. His silence was not weakness, but a wall, a way of swallowing pain until it threatened to drown him from the inside. His back was a map of welts, healed and broken again, each scar a line in a scripture of suffering he had never chosen to write. Silas, the younger, was fire where Isaiah was stone. Thin, restless, his body seemed always on the edge of trembling. Every lash carved deeper into him not only flesh but fury. He could not contain it. His eyes burned with a rage he dared not speak aloud, a rage that would have destroyed him had Isaiah not pressed it down with a steady hand, whispering in the dark, "Not yet." But even Isaiah knew that fire could not be smothered forever. At night, the brothers lay side by side in the quarters, huddled with the others, the air heavy with sweat and sorrow. Whispers passed between them, of the lives they had lost before memory, of freedom spoken like a forbidden hymn, of dreams that felt like smoke, impossible to hold. Some of the others laughed at such talk. Freedom was not for men like them. Yet Silas clung to the whispers, his chest rising with quiet defiance. Isaiah listened, but his silence was its own kind of prayer. Morning always came too soon. The horn would sound, and chains would clink as bodies dragged themselves to the fields. The lash would sing again, striking until the overseer's arm grew weary. And so the days blurred together, marked not by joy but by wounds. The land bloomed under their suffering, cotton rising white as bone, while men bent and bled into the earth. It was here, beneath the weight of the lash, that Isaiah and Silas learned what kind of men they would become. Stone and fire, silence and rage, brothers bound not just by blood, but by scars too deep to heal. And in the hush of those nights, when even the cicadas held their breath, both knew the silence could not last forever. Something waited beyond it, something darker than the whip, something already stirring. Not every heart within those walls was carved from cruelty. Sometimes, in places steeped deepest in suffering, a flicker of mercy dares to survive, though it comes not as salvation, but as a fragile spark, doomed from the start. Her name was Anna, the master's youngest daughter, no more than 15 summers, a pale wisp of a girl who lingered at the edges of fields where her father's voice carried like thunder. She watched the enslaved with eyes different from her kin. Where the master's gaze saw bodies as tools, Anna seemed to see people. It was not freedom she could give them, not power nor safety, only small gestures. Once on a day when the heat pressed down like an iron lid and Silas swayed from hunger, she lingered too long by the fence. In her trembling hands was a scrap of bread, wrapped in cloth as though it were a treasure. Their eyes met, hers wide with fear, his with disbelief, and for a moment time stilled. She extended the bread quickly, almost as if ashamed, and he took it, fingers brushing hers for the briefest instant before she turned and fled. The bread was stale, hardly enough to quiet the hollow ache gnawing at Silas's belly, yet it tasted like nothing he had known before. It was not just food, it was a recognition, a reminder, however fleeting, that someone beyond his brother saw him as human. For Silas, it was warmth in a life made of frost. Isaiah saw only danger. That night, when Silas whispered about her kindness, Isaiah's silence broke into words heavy as stone. "Don't mistake it for salvation," he warned. "Her mercy will not shield you when the lash falls. Bread in your hand does not mean chains off your back." His voice carried no anger, only the weary knowledge of a man who had seen too much. But Silas clung to it all the same. He replayed the moment again and again in his mind, the trembling of her hand, the softness in her eyes. It was foolish, perhaps, yet what else could a starving soul cling to but a scrap of mercy? To him, Anna was proof that even in a world built on cruelty, some sliver of humanity still breathed. Yet kindness, when born in poisoned soil, rarely grows to bloom. It withers, it twists, it turns to sorrow. That scrap of bread, pressed into a trembling hand, was no gift at all. It was a spark thrown into dry grass, and sparks in such places never fade quietly. They burn, and already the shadows had begun to notice. Mercy, in a house of chains, is a dangerous thing. It cannot pass unnoticed for long. Whispers grew like weeds, carried on the wind of jealous eyes. A fellow servant, bitter from his own wounds, saw Anna's trembling hand extend across the fence one evening and stored the vision like a secret coin. Kindness, after all, was worth more than gold in such a place, and every coin could be traded. Isaiah sensed it before the word spread. He knew the air too well, knew how quickly suspicion fermented into cruelty. The master's household was a fortress of watchful eyes, overseers lurking like carrion birds, children repeating what they half understood, and neighbors forever listening for scandal that confirmed their own righteousness. It was only a matter of time before Anna's small gesture was twisted into something forbidden, something dangerous. Silas did not want to hear it. His voice shook as he defended her, speaking of how her eyes held no malice, only sorrow. "She's not like the rest," he whispered fiercely one night. "She sees us. But Isaiah cut him off. "No," he said, with a finality that struck harder than any lash. "She sees you as a child sees a stray dog, a creature to pity, not to free. And when her pity is found out, It will not be her skin split open. It will be yours." The words hung heavy, and though Silas turned away, his shoulders trembled with the weight of a truth he did not wish to carry. He wanted to believe in her. He needed to, for without that fragile kindness, his world was only chains and hunger and the endless cruelty of the whip. But the house was listening. Anna's mother, sharp-eyed and bitter-tongued, had begun to question why her daughter lingered near the fields. And when Anna faltered under those questions, when her cheeks burned and her words tangled, suspicion coiled tighter. A servant's loyalty cracked under pressure, and the sight of bread passed across the fence slipped into the master's ear like poison. The storm broke swiftly. Anna was locked away in her chamber, weeping into her hands. And in the yard, the overseer's lash fell heavier than it had in months. Silas bore it across his back, the flesh tearing, the iron taste of blood filling his mouth, while the master bellowed about disobedience, about keeping slaves in their place. Isaiah watched, jaw set like stone, knowing exactly why the punishment rained down, but saying nothing. That night, as Silas lay shivering on the dirt floor, his wounds raw and burning, Isaiah whispered into the silence, "I told you. Kindness is only another kind of chain." But within Silas's silence was something new, something sharper than sorrow. Betrayal was no longer an idea. It was carved into his flesh. There are moments when silence is no longer possible, when pain swells too large to be swallowed. For Isaiah and Silas, that moment came not with fire or steel, but with the slow drip of humiliation day after day, until the vessel of their endurance cracked. Silas's back was a map of scars, fresh welts crisscrossing old ones like rivers on dried earth. Each lash was meant to bend him lower, to remind him of his place. But beneath his quiet sobs grew something dangerous, a hunger not for bread, nor even freedom, but for reckoning. Isaiah felt it too, though he carried it differently. He had always been the still one, the voice of warning, the shield that bore weight so his younger brother might endure. Yet each night, as Silas moaned in fever and pain, Isaiah's jaw tightened until it ached. He was no stranger to cruelty, but cruelty against his brother struck deeper than the lash could ever reach. The plantation slept one suffocating night beneath a swollen moon. The cicadas shrieked from the trees, their chorus restless, as if they too sensed what was stirring in the dark. In the slave quarters, whispers drifted, whispers of escape, of vengeance, of spirits who watched from the woods. Most dismissed them as dangerous dreams. But for Isaiah and Silas, dreams had curdled into necessity. Silas spoke first, his voice ragged but steady. "We die here," he said, staring at the dirt floor. "Every day, piece by piece. I'd rather meet death standing, not crawling." Isaiah did not answer at once. He studied his brother's hollow face, the fever-bright eyes that no longer feared pain. At last, his own voice came, low and heavy. "Then if we rise together. No half-steps, no turning back." The air thickened around them, as though the walls themselves were listening. It was not a plan yet, not even a vow, but something deeper, the moment two souls chose a path from which there could be no return. Outside, the master's hounds stirred restlessly in their pens. The overseer, drunk on whiskey, muttered in his sleep. And in the distance, the river carried its eternal song, whispering of freedom it would never grant. Isaiah closed his eyes, seeing not the chains but the fire that could break them. Silas's hand clenched into a fist, trembling with fury and resolve. Something had shifted. The brothers were no longer waiting for deliverance. They had become the storm. The house breathed in restless slumber, its timbers creaking beneath the weight of silence. Beyond the cane fields, the swamp lay still, waiting. Within the slave quarters, two brothers no longer dreamed. They moved. Isaiah's hand closed around a rusted blade stolen from the shed, its edge jagged but sharp enough to cut flesh. Silas carried an iron poker, heavy in his trembling grip. Their eyes met once in the dark. No words, no blessing, only the grim understanding that whatever came next would burn away their chains or bury them in eternal night. The master lay in his chamber, breath sour with liquor, his face slack in sleep. For years, his voice had been thunder and his hand the storm. Tonight, thunder would answer him. Isaiah struck first. The blade plunged deep into the man's throat, and the sound was not a scream, but a choking gurgle, as if even death refused him dignity. Blood sprayed across the linens, soaking the bed in a crimson tide. The overseer burst through the hall, half-dressed, pistol raised. Silas leapt with a cry that was half sob, half fury, driving the iron into the man's chest. The overseer stumbled, gasping, clawing at the younger brother's arms as though disbelief could keep him alive. When he fell, silence reclaimed the hall. Only the groan of floorboards and the hiss of blood remained. The mistress awoke to smoke. A torch had been thrown into the parlor, and its flames climbed greedily up the curtains, casting wild shadows against the walls. She shrieked, clutching her nightgown, but Isaiah's hand silenced her. Swift, merciless, her cry cut short like a bird beneath a stone. And then there was Anna. She stood in the doorway, pale in the glow of firelight, her hair falling loose around her face. Her lips parted, but no sound came, only the widening of her eyes, horror and recognition mingling in their depths. She had once given bread. She had once smiled. That fragile kindness now returned to her like a curse. Silas froze, torn between memory and vengeance. Isaiah's voice cut sharp through the roar of flame. No mercy. The poker rose, the blade flashed, and the house erupted with screams that would not be remembered kindly. By the time the night surrendered to dawn, the plantation house was no longer a monument of wealth, but a pyre. Its timbers crackled, falling inward as flames devoured every secret within. The bodies of the master, his overseer, and his family lay among the embers. Isaiah and Silas emerged from the smoke like specters, their skin blackened with soot, their hands dripping with ruin. They had become vengeance made flesh. By dawn, the air was thick with smoke and silence. The house stood no longer, its proud white walls reduced to a blackened skeleton jutting against the sky. The smell of charred wood mingled with the stench of burnt flesh, drifting over the cane fields like a curse the wind could not carry away. The fields that once rang with the crack of the whip now held only echoes. Slaves from the quarters crept near, eyes wide, hands trembling as they beheld what had been done. Where once stood the master's pride and cruelty, now smoldered only ruin. They found no living soul within the ash, only bodies unrecognizable, twisted in fire's embrace. But of Isaiah and Silas, there was nothing, no corpse among the cinders, no chains left behind in the quarters. Only footprints stamped deep in the damp earth, leading toward the swamp. The tracks vanished beneath the curtain of moss and shadow, swallowed by waters that kept their secrets well. Neighbors soon came, riding hard upon hearing rumors of fire and screams in the night. They dismounted before the wreckage, grim faces pale as they stared into the embers. The master's kin were counted among the dead, his overseer beside him. Anna, the daughter, was never found whole. Whispers claimed her ghost slipped into the swamp, wandering beside the brothers who had once known her smile. Men muttered of justice, swore vengeance, spoke of hunting dogs and rifles. Yet as the days stretched on, no man dared step deep into the swamp where the prince had led. They said the waters whispered at night, that chains rattled where no wind blew. Some claimed they heard screams when thunder rolled, as if the storm itself bore witness to the slaughter. Among the enslaved, the tale was told in hushed voices, never in daylight. Mothers pressed trembling fingers to their children's lips and warned them of fire and fury. Some said Isaiah and Silas had become more than men, that their rage had burned so hot it carried them beyond death into something darker, something eternal. The land itself seemed changed. The cane grew heavy, bending as though beneath sorrow. Birds abandoned the trees that bordered the plantation. At night, No song was heard but the frogs in the swamp, and beneath their croaks, faintly, a sound like the drag of chains through water. The ruin of the house was left to rot, untouched, a monument of ash. No plow turned that soil again. No laughter, no cruelty, no human voice rose where fire had spoken louder. What had been a man's empire had become a grave. And in the silence, legend began to take root. Years passed, but the land did not heal. Grass grew tall where the cane once swayed, but it carried no sweetness. The charred bones of the house sagged deeper into the soil, half swallowed by weeds, as though the earth itself wished to bury the memory. Yet memory would not be buried. It lived in whispers, in shadows, in the restless breath of the swamp. They said Isaiah and Silas never died, that the fire had not claimed them, nor the swamp concealed them, but that they had slipped into something beyond flesh. At night, travelers swore they heard the clink of chains drifting across the water, though no man walked there. Hunters spoke of two dark figures moving through the cane, faces obscured, their eyes burning with a red glow like embers that refused to fade. Children dared each other to step near the ruins on moonless nights. Some returned pale and silent, swearing they saw a woman's shape in the smoke. Anna, weeping, her white dress torn, following the brothers wherever they roamed. Others claimed they felt a hand brush their shoulder, cold and heavy as iron, though no living soul was near. Preachers thundered that vengeance breeds only curses, that the brothers had damned themselves by blood. Yet their voices trembled when storms broke and thunder cracked like the whip of a master, and the wind moaned like men in chains. For in those moments, even the holy feared the wrath that lingers. Among the enslaved, the story was kept alive not in fear, but in quiet reverence. Mothers told their children that Isaiah and Silas had risen when no one else could, that they had broken silence with screams the earth could not forget. Their tale was a warning, but also a reminder. Even the oppressed could become fire. The swamp remained their grave, their altar, their kingdom. Some said if you walked too deep among its cypress trees, you would hear a voice whisper enough, the very words Samuel once gave Silas beneath the cicada's cry. Enough suffering, enough silence, enough chains. No grave bears their names. No hymn redeems their deeds. The plantation is dust, but the legend breathes. In every storm, in every silence heavy with grief, the brothers walk again. Their chains are no longer shackles, but echoes, and the land remembers, always. And when the night falls heavy, when the air tastes of ash and the trees groan like mourners, some say you can still hear it. The sound of fire devouring wood, of footsteps vanishing into the swamp, of vengeance that time itself could not bury. The story ends but does not close. It lingers, haunting, like a curse whispered on the wind.